At some point, something in you just stopped fighting back. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone noticed. You didn't break down, you didn't fall apart. You just, quietly, started feeling less. And the strangest part isn't that it happened. It's that when you try to remember exactly when, you can't. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up on your face. It doesn't make you cry in the shower or cancel plans or stare into space for hours. Well, maybe it does sometimes. But mostly it just makes everything feel slightly muffled, like you're hearing your own life through a wall. People talk to you, you respond, you laugh when you're supposed to laugh. You nod. You say, "I'm fine," with the exact right amount of tiredness in your voice so nobody presses further, and it works every time, which should probably bother you more than it does. That's the part worth sitting with. Not the exhaustion itself, but how practiced you've become at performing around it. You've gotten very good at reading rooms, at knowing what version of yourself a situation requires and slipping into it before anyone has to ask. Around certain people, you're lighter, easier, more agreeable. Around others, you're quieter. You adjust without thinking. And somewhere in all that adjusting, you stopped being entirely sure which one is actually you, if any of them still are. Most people, when they hear emotionally numb, imagine someone flat, expressionless, stone-faced in a waiting room. But that's not really what it looks like from the inside. From the inside, it looks like a full life. Busy days, conversations, small joys even. It looks functional. It looks fine. The numbness isn't an absence of everything. It's more like a lowered ceiling, like your emotional range quietly compressed itself, and now everything fits neatly within it. And you almost didn't notice because the compression was so gradual. You still feel things. Of course you do. You're not a wall. But there's something different now about how far those feelings go before they just stop. Good news lands, and you smile. And then 30 seconds later, you're already somewhere else, mentally. Someone says something kind to you, and there's a half-second delay before it registers, like a satellite signal slightly out of sync. You noticed that once. You made a note of it internally, then you moved on. That moving on, that's become very fast, hasn't it? There's a particular kind of loneliness that people don't talk about honestly because it doesn't fit the image of loneliness we're used to. It's not being alone on a Friday night. It's being in a room full of people you genuinely like, following the conversation, contributing to it, and still feeling like there's a sheet of glass between you and the moment you're standing in. Present in every measurable way, somewhere else entirely. You go home later and someone asks how the night was, and you say, "It was good," and you mean it, sort of. But you also can't fully explain why you feel like you watched the night from a slight distance rather than lived it. That distance. When did it start feeling normal? Some friendships have gotten quieter in ways you haven't fully examined. Not fallen apart, just gently receded. You tell yourself it's natural, adult life, everyone's busy, and that's all true. But there are also people you used to reach out to just because you wanted to, not for any reason, just to share something small or stupid or nothing at all. And you don't do that anymore. You wait for a reason. Or you draft the message and close the app. Or you think about them for a moment, and then the moment passes, and somehow that becomes enough of a substitute for the actual conversation. The thought replaced the connection, and it happened so smoothly you almost missed it. What's strange is that none of this feels like grief. Grief has weight to it. This is more like weight that's been very slowly redistributed until you can't quite locate where it went. At night, when there's no task to complete and no version of yourself to perform and the day's structure falls away, that's when it gets a little louder. Not loud, just louder. Thoughts that don't lead anywhere. Old memories that surface without invitation. Questions that circle without resolving. You're not spiraling. You're not even particularly sad. It's more like your mind keeps trying to find something to land on and can't quite settle. So you scroll. Or you put something on in the background just to fill the space. Not because you're interested, but because the alternative, just sitting there with whatever that feeling is, seems harder than it should be for no reason you can clearly name. And you've probably never said that out loud to anyone, not that version of it. That's what makes this so easy to miss, in yourself, in others, because nothing is obviously wrong. You're not in crisis, you're managing. By most measures, you're doing fine, but there's a difference between doing fine and actually feeling like yourself, between moving through your days and being present in them, between going through the motions of your own life and actually inhabiting it. That difference can stay invisible for a long time. Sometimes it stays invisible until something small and seemingly unimportant happens. A song, a conversation, a moment that should feel like more than it does. And you notice, for just a second, that you felt almost nothing. And you can't tell if that's relief or loss. That question is worth staying with. Because what's actually happening underneath all of this, the muffled feeling, the automatic adjusting, the distance from moments that should land, has a shape to it, a logic. And in the next part, we'll start to look at exactly where that shape comes from. Not as a list of symptoms to check off, but as a real internal process. One that most people are quietly inside of without realizing it started long before they could have noticed. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. There's something that happens to your relationship with yourself when you've been running on low for too long. It's not that you stop knowing who you are exactly. It's more that the question stops feeling urgent. You used to have opinions about things, small things even. What kind of day you wanted, what you actually felt like doing, what you needed from someone before you could tell them what you needed. Somewhere along the way, those inner signals got quieter, and you got better at filling the silence with whatever was most convenient, with whatever made things easier for everyone, including yourself. Easier became a strategy before you ever decided to make it one. There's a particular thing that happens in conversations now. Someone asks what you want, where to eat, what you think, how you're feeling about something. And instead of going inward to check, you go outward. You scan them first. You read the slight lean in their question, the expectation underneath it, and you answer from that. Not to deceive anyone, just because the outward scan got faster than the inward one. Just because somewhere along the line, your own preference started feeling like the slower, less reliable source of information. So you learned to outsource. And you're very good at it now. You rarely give wrong answers. People find you easy to be around. Low maintenance, understanding. The kind of person who just goes with the flow. You've heard that phrase said about you like it's a compliment, and you've accepted it like one, even though some part of you knows that what looks like flexibility from the outside has a different texture from the inside. It's less freedom and more absence of resistance, less ease and more not knowing where to locate the preference that would create friction. That's a strange thing to realize about yourself. There are probably things you used to enjoy that you haven't done in a while. Not because anything changed about them, but because the pull toward them just gradually weakened. And you've been meaning to return, and somehow haven't. And now enough time has passed that going back feels like it would require a version of enthusiasm you can't currently locate. It's not grief about losing it. It's more like you keep noticing the empty space where the want used to be, and then moving on before you have to decide what to do about it. Which is its own kind of answer, though you haven't named it yet. Memory does something interesting when you're in this state. You'll find yourself returning to specific moments, usually unremarkable ones. A particular afternoon, a specific conversation that wasn't important, a version of yourself in a setting you can barely describe, and you're not sure what you're looking for in that memory. But you keep going back, like a room you keep walking into without remembering why you came. It's not nostalgia, exactly. It's more like a dim recognition that something was different then, that there was more texture somewhere, that things landed differently. You can't quite reconstruct what that felt like, which is the part that quietly unsettles you, and then the moment passes, because the moments always pass now, faster than they used to. There's also this. The way you talk about your own life has changed. Not the facts of it, the tone. Somewhere between what happened and how you describe it, a layer got removed. Events that should carry weight come out flat. Stories you tell about yourself, even difficult ones, come out almost clinical. And the strangest thing isn't that other people don't always notice. It's that you don't always notice either until someone responds with more emotion than you brought to the telling. And for a second, you feel something you can't quite name, almost like watching them mourn something on your behalf that you've already somehow made peace with. Except peace isn't really the right word for it. You've become very careful with certain topics. Not avoidant, exactly. You'll discuss them. You can be articulate about them. You just keep them at a particular distance while you do. Like you're describing a landscape you can see clearly but can't feel the temperature of. And people sometimes interpret that as strength, as having worked through something, which is not entirely wrong, but it's not quite right either. Working through something leaves a residue of feeling. This is more like the feeling was processed so thoroughly that what came out the other side is a very clean, very hollow understanding. Something worth noticing. When was the last time you were genuinely surprised by your own reaction to something? Not a performed surprise, not a social response, but an actual, unguarded moment where you felt something before you had the chance to manage it? If you have to think back that far, that interval itself is information. The managing has become so automatic that it runs ahead of the experience now, like a security system that activates before there's any actual threat, which keeps everything safe, keeps everything smooth, and slowly, quietly keeps everything just slightly out of reach. That's what makes this hard to name from the inside. It doesn't feel like damage. It doesn't feel like loss. It mostly just feels like, this is how things are now. This is the temperature of things, and you keep functioning, and people keep not noticing, and enough days go by that it starts to feel less like something that happened to you, and more like something you simply became. But there's a question underneath all of this that this section hasn't answered yet, and that's deliberate, because the patterns, the outward scanning, the flattened telling, the missing want, the managed distance, these aren't random. They don't appear from nowhere. They have a logic to them, a structure that started assembling itself long before you were conscious of it. And in the next part, we'll start to look at where that structure actually comes from. Not as explanation, not as diagnosis, but as something that's been quietly shaping the way you move through your own life. And something that, once you see it clearly, can't quite be unseen. Here's the thing about patterns. They don't ask permission. They don't announce themselves. They just begin quietly in response to something that felt unsafe or overwhelming or simply too much. And then they keep going long after the original reason has passed. Long after the situation that made them necessary no longer exists. And so what started as a response becomes a habit. And what started as a habit becomes eventually something you call your personality. That's the uncomfortable part. Some of what you call yourself, the even-keeled one, the low-maintenance one, the one who doesn't need much, that might not be who you are. It might be who you learned to be in a context that no longer applies, in response to something you haven't fully examined yet. Think about the version of you that scans rooms before deciding how to feel in them. That reads the emotional temperature before contributing your own. That checks whether it's safe to be honest before you're honest. That version of you was at some point a very smart response to an environment where being unread or unwanted or too much had real consequences. It wasn't a flaw, it was intelligence, applied to survival. The problem isn't that it developed. The problem is that it never got the update that said, you don't need it here. Not in the same way, not all the time, not anymore. And so it kept running. There's a particular kind of fear underneath people-pleasing that almost nobody names accurately. It's not really the fear of conflict, though that's part of it. It's not really the fear of rejection, though that's there too. It's something closer to the fear of becoming burdensome, of taking up more space than you've been silently allocated, of needing something and having that need land badly, land as too much, land as something the other person didn't want to carry. So you preemptively compress yourself. You trim the request before you make it. You add apologies to the edges of wants. You downgrade what you actually need into something smaller and more palatable and easier to give. And then you accept that smaller version and call it fine, and you almost believe it. The part you don't say out loud is that you made that calculation so quickly you barely noticed making it. What gets interesting is how that same fear, the one about becoming too much, eventually starts operating inside your relationship with yourself. You stop asking what you actually need, not just because you're worried about the other person's reaction, but because somewhere along the line, you internalized the judgment. You became your own editor before the need could even fully form. And so now the question, what do I want, genuinely doesn't always yield an answer. Not because you're indifferent, but because the wanting got intercepted so consistently, so early, that it learned not to announce itself. That's not numbness in the way people usually picture it. It's more like a deep, careful silence. An emotional self-censorship so practiced it no longer feels like suppression. It just feels like how you are. There's another layer to this, one that shows up in how you relate to your own history. Most people, when they think about their past, don't register the moments where they slowly learned to make themselves smaller. Those moments don't announce themselves. They don't leave obvious marks. What they leave instead is a felt sense that certain emotions are acceptable and others are privately suspect. That needing comfort is somewhere between acceptable and weak. That anger is somewhere between valid and dangerous. That sadness is fine in small doses, but becomes self-indulgent past a certain duration. And you learned those private thresholds from somewhere, from specific people, specific responses, specific silences that said more than anything spoken ever could. You internalized someone else's tolerance for your emotions, and you've been enforcing their limits ever since, without their name attached to it anymore. That's the thing about emotional conditioning. It doesn't stay linked to its origin. It detaches. It generalizes. It starts to feel like truth rather than learned behavior. Like the ceiling is just low rather than like something lowered it. And so you don't push against it. You don't question the height of the room. You just accommodate habitually the way you always have. Here's a realization that tends to land quietly but not easily. The emotional distance you feel from your own life, that mild sense of watching rather than being in it, might not be the result of too much pain. It might be the result of too much management. The watching is not detachment by nature. It's detachment by design. At some point, the watching became safer than the participating. Being slightly outside the moment meant you couldn't be caught off guard by it, couldn't be moved somewhere you didn't plan to go, couldn't need something before you had a chance to decide if that need was appropriate. Control and numbness, it turns out, are more related than most people want to believe. And this is what makes it so difficult to locate the beginning of. Because it didn't feel like shutting down, it felt like getting better at things, better at handling situations, better at not overreacting, better at being stable, composed, fine. And those are good qualities. They are. But there's a version of them that comes from genuine security, and there's a version that comes from something else entirely. And those two versions can look almost identical from the outside, almost identical even from your own inside. The difference between them is something most people only start to feel when they stop long enough to notice what they've been filling the silence with, and why going quiet makes something in them subtly uncomfortable. That discomfort isn't random, and it isn't a flaw in your wiring. It's pointing at something specific, something that, once you begin to see it clearly, starts to quietly reorganize the way you understand your own emotional life. Not all at once, but gradually, in the way that real things shift. In the next part, we'll sit with what that something actually is. There's a certain relief that comes from understanding something you've been living inside of without a name for it, not because the understanding fixes anything, not because it makes the pattern disappear, but because something shifts when you stop interpreting your own behavior as evidence of personal failing and start recognizing it as evidence of adaptation. Those are very different conclusions, and the distance between them, between something is wrong with me and something made sense about this at the time, is more significant than it might initially seem. You were not broken into emotional numbness. You moved toward it, carefully, incrementally, because something in your environment, your relationships, your interior life, made full feeling feel like too high a cost to keep paying. And that decision, if you can even call it a decision, was not weakness. It was the mind finding a way to continue functioning when functioning felt threatened. That deserves something other than judgment, even if the pattern is no longer useful, even if the cost of maintaining it has quietly exceeded the cost it was built to avoid. That accounting most people never do. There's a particular kind of self-understanding that isn't cathartic. It doesn't arrive with relief, exactly. It arrives more like recognizing someone in an old photograph, someone you've been looking at for years without really seeing. And suddenly you see them. And the recognition is neither good nor bad. It's just accurate. This is what you've been doing. This is how long you've been doing it. This is the shape it took. And something in that clarity is both the most uncomfortable and the most honest place you've been in a while. Because honesty with yourself is strange when you've spent a long time being very fluent in a softer version of it. Here's something that tends to arrive quietly. Once you see the outward scanning, once you recognize that you've been reading rooms before entering them, outsourcing your preferences, editing your needs before they're spoken, you start to notice how constant it is. Not in a dramatic way, just in a steady, low-level way. Like background noise you've been hearing so long it registered as silence. And noticing it doesn't make it stop. That's the part people don't always expect. Awareness doesn't switch the behavior off. What it does is create a small but significant space between the impulse and the action. A beat, a breath, a moment where you can see the pattern moving before you're already inside it. That space is not small, even when it feels like it is. there's also something worth sitting with about the relationships that quietly receded. The friendships that got slower, thinner, less reciprocal. For a long time, the available explanation was logistics. Life got busy, people changed, and those things are true. But there's another layer, one that's harder to look at directly, which is that some of those connections required a kind of emotional presence that, somewhere in this process, became genuinely difficult to maintain. Not because you stopped caring, but because presence costs something, and you were already running a deficit. And so the relationships that asked for more than the ones that let you coast, they got less, even if that was never a conscious choice. Understanding that doesn't undo the distance, but it changes what the distance means. It moves it from evidence of coldness to evidence of depletion, which is a different thing to be carrying. There's a moment for most people who recognize themselves in any of this where a specific memory surfaces. Not necessarily a dramatic one, often something minor. A moment where you said, "I'm fine," and the other person accepted it, and you felt something that wasn't quite relief. Or a night where you had every reason to feel something and instead just felt quiet. And noted that quiet the way you'd note weather, and moved on. Those small moments are worth more attention than they usually get, because they're where the pattern became visible, if only briefly, and you saw it, even then. You just didn't know what you were seeing. The realization that tends to land last and sit longest is this: emotional numbness is not the absence of a self. It's a self in protective stillness. There's still a version of you underneath the management, underneath the scanning, underneath the carefully calibrated responses. That version has preferences, reactions, needs that didn't disappear just because they stopped being expressed. They became quiet. They became patient. And they've been there the whole time, waiting with a kind of persistence that has nothing to do with hope and everything to do with the simple fact that they're yours, and they didn't leave when you left them. That's not a comfortable realization. It's not meant to be. It's the kind of thing you turn over for a long time before you know what to do with it. And that's fine, because knowing what to do with it is not the point right now. Seeing it is the point, holding it without immediately managing it, letting it be what it is for a moment without converting it into something more bearable. You've been very good at making things bearable. It might be worth, occasionally, not doing that. The emotional life you've been living through a pane of glass has not stopped being yours. It has been waiting very quietly for you to stop treating your own feelings as a problem to be solved before they're allowed to exist. And whether that waiting turns into anything, whether this kind of seeing becomes the beginning of something, or whether it just settles into your understanding the way certain things do without urgency, is not something that needs to be decided right now. Right now, the only thing is the noticing, and maybe that's enough to start with. If anything in this felt like something you've been carrying quietly, tell me in the comments. Not what you think you should say, just what was true.